In this episode, I speak with Charlie Simson from Plucky Frank, who is a positive psychology and culture expert and a self-proclaimed geek. She was the former head of flourishing at Belroy here in Victoria and has a great depth of knowledge and a great breadth of knowledge also in what it means to lead amidst uncertainty, ambiguity, and also what it takes to really craft a wholesome and engaging workplace culture based on well-being, based on performance, and based on nurturing creativity. So we really explore topics around self-regulation, taking a principles-based perspective as opposed to narrative-based perspective, and speaking clearly more than simply speaking kindly in the way of fostering a courageous culture. To note also, we did record this conversation at the very onset of COVID-19 here in Melbourne in April 2020. And so whilst much of our conversation is deeply relevant to what it really means to live fully and lead fully, we did have this conversation in the context of COVID-19. And so it's also deeply relevant to what it means to remain connected to the grace and to the grit and to ground in this time of extreme liminality. So buckle up and enjoy. Grab a tea, take a breath, notice the inhale, the exhale, and the space between. A moment in between moments. Here you are. You're listening to Spaces Between with your friend and host, L. Jeffrey. An open exploration into restoring connection in the 21st century in our personal lives, our relations, and our communities. What does it mean to live in relationship to the wholeness of who we are together? I'm not one for ads and am one for creating something beautiful with others, in this case, you. So if you enjoy our time together, I do invite you to subscribe on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, rate and leave a review for the show. And if you're feeling super generous and fueled and filled up by our conversations, you might even consider donating or soon joining my Patreon membership. Just visit www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com, where you'll also find show notes and other useful links and resources following these conversations. So this is it. Let's dive in. All right. Good morning. We are sitting here on a beautiful autumnal Wednesday morning, and I'm sitting here with Charlie Simson. Thank you for joining, Charlie.
No worries. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we're in quite a funny time. I think it's important to note, I suppose, the context in which we're meeting. It is rather unique. April 2020, we had our grand plans and the world, the universe, or who knows, dealt us a different set of cards. So before we get into the context of yourself and your work and your life and your journey, it seems important to note the context in which we're having this conversation. I'm curious how you are sitting with and trying to make sense of this time.
It's a great question. I think for me, I'm fairly unaffected in a lot of ways. It's a thing that's made me realize, I already felt quite fortunate, but this has been quite obvious just how fortunate someone like me is. I have a nice place to have a home office. I have work that I can do remotely. I have, a great partner and dog that I live with. We fortunately don't have kids, so we're not having to deal with kids who would normally be at school or childcare, and they're kind of in your space while you're trying to work. And we have quite a lot of space in our house, so we're not feeling too cooped up. We have enough financial sort of situation to be not too stressed about what's going on from our own personal perspective. But having said that, it's still pretty shocking to see what's going on, in Australia, but also in the rest of the world.
Yeah.
So I guess my main focus has been on trying to kind of help wherever I can, which sort of, includes small things like making sure I keep in touch with my friends and colleagues and checking in to make sure everyone's okay, and making an effort to connect socially with people. Particularly, I've got some friends who live on their own, so that's kind of a lot more isolating if you have to isolate at home and there's no one else there. And then aside from that, sort of work-wise, I've been making sure that I've been helping anyone who I can. So I sort of offered out on LinkedIn to have free sessions with people who need help adjusting, either with kind of sending their workforce remote or with something like, if they've got issues with not being able to maintain their workforce, needing to figure out how they kind of strategize to keep as many people as they can, how to communicate, how to kind of help their workforce support each other, all of that kind of stuff. So it's small things, but it's the kind of thing that I can do a little bit of, and I like doing it anyway. So
yeah,
that's kind of how I'm trying to handle it.
Yeah, lovely.
What about you?
Yeah, well, for me, it's a deeply complex time. And in the beginning, definitely felt the kind of pattern of addictive doing coming in, where, we've kind of been prescribed a retreat, which is a very, maybe also privileged way of looking at it. But we've been prescribed isolation and stillness, essentially. And when faced with stillness, we either accept the stillness or the addictive doing becomes more obvious. And we find ourselves scurrying to hustle and to find solutions quickly. And I did definitely find myself doing that, and also comparing myself against many other, facilitators or people in our field out there who are all of a sudden running online webinars on this, that, and the other, and just like this flurry of online content, which I found myself really consumed in and then comparing myself against. And then realized that, no, maybe this is a beautiful opportunity to actually listen, to pause for a little while, to reflect, to filter. Yeah. And so I'm curious if you had a similar process of like adjusting to this dramatic shift. But yeah, what your process was for me, it's holding myself as someone who's generally holding space for others, balancing the desire to hold space for others in this time with holding space for oneself first, so that space holding for others comes from a genuine place. Yeah. Have you felt yourself going through some sort of shift or reconciliation in that way?
A little. I think everybody's had to adjust a fair bit because, even if you're as fortunate as I was to start with, and the adjustment was much probably easier than it would have been for some people, I think it's still weird to kind of have to, to have not really left the house except to go to the supermarket for, I think we've been in isolation now for 3 weeks, something like that.
Yeah.
It's, it is odd. But honestly, I feel like my adjustment has been relatively small compared to many others. I think because we already spend quite a lot of time at home. Like my partner and I are pretty chill when we're not working. And because I already do a lot of work where holding space is kind of like a very large part of what I'm doing when I work with organizations. So I sort of have a pretty solid self-care kind of routine. I guess there were a few small adjustments. Like I used to do some of my exercise outside of my house, like in classes and that kind of thing. And obviously those are not happening anymore, but most of what I do there, I can do at home. So it was, it was actually surprisingly not as hard for me as I thought it might be.
Yeah.
I think the hardest thing for me has probably just been that I need a little bit more organization around making sure that I'm tracking who I need to be checking in with, because where it used to be easier to just go to a place, like I would go to my clients' offices, for example, and then all of the people that I would need to check in with are there. So it's kind of easy and you can sort of look them in the face and see whether they actually are okay or not. Whereas now I have to sort of much more actively kind of I literally have a list of people. And I'm like, okay, when have I checked in with these people and how are they doing? And when do I need to check in with them again so that I don't kind of miss someone?
Yeah. Brilliant. Yeah, it's really forcing us to learn different ways of nurturing relationships in a sense. I know I have a lot of online relationships and people overseas that I do connect with. Like once a month we have our call. And some of them find that super weird because they're people who really value, as I do as well, in-person conversations and relationships. And so they'd prefer not to have an online call because it just doesn't service their needs in some. And so they kind of, they have never understood that, and they find it challenging to keep up with online communications. But this time in talking to them, they've really had to learn how to do that.
Yeah.
Because I'm the same.
Yeah.
I have a wonder list of like my global tribe of people who I enjoy, who I feel full after talking with, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And it reminds me every month, have I checked in with this group of people? And people find that a bit much, but it's kind of important now, as long as you're in it, in a sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And I think if you're like, it's easier to not need a list of some kind if you have some way where groups of people sort of exist together, either like a workplace or some kind of club, or like, you know, you have your sort of circle of friends and you invite them all over.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that probably you and I have had a little bit more of for a while that other people are needing to do now is that you're having more one-on-ones. And I also have a lot of friends and colleagues and stuff who are overseas. So, you know, I'm used to having those Zoom connections or, you know, whatever video chats with them and having them one-on-one. And when you're having lots of one-on-ones, like you realize that actually you have sort of, I have a regular list of sort of 15 or 20 people that I catch up with. You can't retain all of those people in your head in a simple way. So it's much easier to just make sure that I'm not missing anyone.
Yeah.
That I want to, because they make me feel better, as well as kind of, you know, it's like definitely selfish as well as a giving act as well. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's they're kind of friend tours, I find.
Yeah,
where we really
totally.
just keep each other accountable to our highest selves and the conversations that fuel you. So there's a little bit of context about the time, which I think will be an ongoing theme for our conversation, because it just feels deeply relevant. And all of what we speak about, culture and connection and well-being, is of course deeply relevant, no matter the context really. But for a bit of context on you as a human who's on a journey and been on a journey for some time, how would you describe to somebody who you are, not just what you do, but the curiosities, the passions that drive your being in the world? How would you describe or give someone an insight into yourself?
That's
big question.
Big question. So I think like the core thing that I follow, as in the interest that I follow, is that I love humans, particularly humans in systems. So I'm sort of deeply, deeply curious about all levels of that, from like the very, very micro, you know, how does an interaction between two people occur? What sort of, you know, facial expressions and the vibe that's coming through from people, how do we actually understand what that is and how it happens, right up to kind of how do we understand like entire global systems of, you know, like for example, in coronavirus, one of the things I've been watching is like the way that humanity in general fails to track mathematical concepts. So like we have all of the information to know how exponential curves operate. And we have all of the information to know that, you know, with this virus, there's a couple of weeks lag between when you kind of get exposed to it and contract something to when you might sort of be getting quite sick. And so we kind of should be able to do better as a global group at kind of acting now to prevent things in the future when they're only a few weeks away. And yet what we've seen globally is that we're not doing that very well. And that has just been like, it's obviously not great, but it's also been really fascinating for me to kind of watch, like, how does the world adapt to something that is very, very obviously a system with cause and effect, and cause and effect that we know about. So it's not like we're trying to figure out what it is. There are people who, and many of them, who can tell us what's going to come down the road. And yet as a group, we find it difficult to actually behave as if that's really going to happen until we start seeing the real results right now. And then we're a bit late. So interesting. And I'm curious about, I mean, it's such a complex topic. And then there's the system, and then there's the fact that we're humans who have a subjective experience and we're interacting with the system. And so the fear that we're now carrying, the uncertainty and our ability to possibly self-regulate or not, and therefore make decisions based on the systems that we are creating or have created. What have you observed in terms of the human aspect of the systems and the mathematics that you're describing, but in terms of, our human capacities
and how this time is really revealing the capacities that we have or don't have.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is going to get pretty nerdy pretty fast, but
Great.
I'll go there anyway.
Yeah.
So I guess what I've been seeing is that when you look at developmental psychology for adults, one of the things we see is that there are stages in the way in which people understand the world. And in each of the stages, there's kind of, as you develop further, you gain the ability to kind of see more from a global level.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we see primarily is that the bulk of adults sit in a stage where the main way that they understand the world is through stories, through narrative. Mm-hmm. And so you can see how that plays out in things like the media, where it's difficult for people to grasp something like what's going to happen with exponential curves and whether or not they personally are at risk until they see a story of someone that they can relate to who has actually contracted the virus and is actually sick. So, for example, seeing things like Prince Charles has got coronavirus, or Boris has got coronavirus, or Tom Hanks and his wife who got coronavirus here. When we see stories like that, it helps people to connect that they are also vulnerable, because when we see people who generally speaking we know to be more fortunate than ourselves, it's pretty hard to then say, well, I must be somehow protected because, whatever story we had for ourselves about how we're safe actually starts to break down. So you can see how those kinds of stories of personal experiences that people have had, where it's someone that they can relate to or someone who they feel that they are kind of, if Tom Hanks gets it, it's hard for me to say that like my fortunate privileged position will protect me if it didn't protect him. So that's been kind of interesting, is watching how the narratives help people to connect to the reality of what's going on. Mm-hmm. And in particular, this virus has been quite interesting because it's unusual to see an illness that is actually more likely to hit privileged people. Mm-hmm. But this one actually is. It's more likely to be a problem if you're male. Mm-hmm. It's more likely to be a problem if you travel. It's more likely to be a problem if you're older. You're more likely to travel if you have more money. So actually, like privileged, white, rich men
male
who are rarely at risk of anything are actually much more at risk for this virus than, people who are kind of less prone to traveling, at least in the early stages. I mean, I'm sure we'll see that it goes through everyone, but that's been kind of an interesting thing to see, that it's sort of very quickly people have adapted to the idea that they are actually personally at risk. Mm-hmm. And in part, I think that's because we see these stories of people who are very privileged being affected by it and not being immune. So that's kind of been interesting, but also kind of looking at it from a perspective of what would help the world to be able to adapt to something like this more quickly. That's been kind of less positive from my interpretation of what's going on. And that's because to be able to understand, like viscerally understand, and therefore be able to act now when something is going to happen in the future, it's very difficult for people to be able to do that from a narrative understanding of the world. Because when we don't have recent experience of something like this happening, it's very difficult to connect our story now with a story that, say the Spanish flu story, which is a narrative that's there and available and could show us what's going on. Because it's so far removed from our daily experiences, it's difficult to connect what happened then with what happened now. And so I think in the early stages, people who are operating on this narrative understanding of the world, the narrative wasn't close enough to feel like it was actually predictive of what was going to happen. Even though if you're looking at it from a different perspective, say if you're looking at from a principled perspective, which is one of the next stages, then you can see that actually the core principles of what happened in the Spanish flu absolutely do apply. Even though, we are like radically more wealthy, have better healthcare systems, have a radically different kind of society from 1918, it's actually the case that things on a kind of transmission of a disease like this sort of level, they're not that different. And if anything, they're worse. So we're not actually likely to be any better off now than we were in 1918, because like what happens when things transmit from one person to another through kind of, you know, airborne or touch or whatever, those kind of things. We don't have protection against that in a standard way because we don't normally need it. So what we see is when people can actually operate on this principled understanding where they're looking at what are the key features of how a disease like this transmits from one person to the next, and then can look at our current context to see whether that those features exist now or are even potentially worse now than they were. When you can do that, it's pretty quick and easy to see that actually we need to act now, and that the cause and effect relationship means that it's not a guess about what's going to happen. We know what's going to happen. And that's rare, right? It's very rare in the world that you can actually predict something that's going to happen 2 weeks from now. Because cause and effect relationships in most of what we're trying to predict are much more complicated than this. This is actually a relatively simple relationship and relatively certain as well. And so when you're able to operate on that principled level, you can say to yourself and believe very clearly that this is a certainty. It's going to happen. And therefore, acting now is not a risk. Acting now is like 100% better than acting tomorrow.
Yeah.
But you can sort of see how this has played out politically, that either the politicians are not understanding things that way, or more likely they're aware of the fact that the general populace who votes them in doesn't necessarily understand things in that way. And so that means that there's a political risk associated with acting now, because if the general populace doesn't understand that this was a certainty, that this was going to happen, then if you prevent it, you might look like you overreacted.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's a political risk, which unfortunately did not work in our favour.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Politics versus public health and the trade-off. Would you, just relating, so the narrative, I suppose, way of relating to the world, and then principles or first principles, a way of relating to the world. Would you say that I'm curious about the transition between the two. So how does one move between the two? And would you say it has something to do with, so like we have the sensate, the affective, and the cognitive aspects of ourself, to move from being story-based, which is very much maybe the limbic system, narrative, and the affective aspect of ourselves?
It's definitely it's all three.
Okay.
It's all three connected. So I guess like if you had to pick one, it's more cognitive than anything else because it's about sense making.
Yeah.
Obviously, what you're making sense of very much includes, you know, your senses and the emotional components of that. But the primary thing that adult development theory is looking at is how do you make sense of what's going on? How do you kind of hold it in your mind? Yeah. And the interesting thing is that it's a really interesting theory, but it's actually been very difficult to study. One of the things that's very tricky with psychology, which I'm sure you're aware of, is that because humans are so complex, that all of the kind of holistic theories of how we operate are intensely difficult to study because there's so many things going on. It's very difficult to isolate one from another. And that's been true certainly of developmental theories, particularly of adults, because to be able to see development, you need to track people over very long periods of time. And our methods of studying that kind of thing are still pretty crap, to be honest. Yeah. It's very expensive to do. And realistically, what you want to do if you were going to study something like this and you had infinite money is you would actually kind of want to Truman Show things a little bit, where you were able to have like extremely rich data like video and audio of people sort of walking around in their daily lives and interacting with each other, and then interviewing them to understand how they're making sense of what's happening. But as you can imagine, doing that with large numbers of people is also, I mean, aside from the just immense cost of doing something like that, it's also a little bit tricky ethically.
Yeah.
Because people don't really want to be observed that way, which is fair.
And also, people will respond, like, ultimately, it's building metacognition, the ability to think about how we think, and therefore how we make sense, and being able to organize our mind around maybe more complex topics, not the kind of simple, binary, dualistic topics that most of our minds are designed around, which is important. But if we were to go around and survey people, to have the capacity to even think about how we think is such a unique ability that takes crafting and self-reflection and practice. Yeah.
And generally other people around you. So the things that we do know that help are to be around other people who are either also wanting to push themselves into a sort of new space, or even better is to have some people around you who are kind of already thinking in that way, in that more complex way.
Yeah.
And so I think what's actually happening mechanistically, like how it really works, is that when you're around someone who thinks that way, you get multiple things. You get a model, so you get to see them and how they're doing it, which means you get to kind of see that there's something that they're doing that works better, basically. And usually, initially, you have no idea what that is. They just kind of seem smart or wise or some other kind of magical thing where you're like, that person knows what's going to happen. How do they do that? But also if you have the opportunity to interact with those people, then also they tend to pose questions to you that point your mind in the right direction. And often the initial experience of that will be like relatively confronting and quite confusing because the questions are weird. And that's kind of the nature of a great question, is that it's a question that you haven't thought that way before. And so therefore the experience is like quite shocking because you literally have not had that experience before of thinking that way.
Yeah.
And it can, for some people, it can be confronting in a quite threatening way where it feels like it's making them feel dumb, for example. But for many people, if it's done in the right way and there's enough support around, then it's a sort of intensely curious experience. You just sort of go, like, I literally see people do this at me. Like, huh?
The chills. Yeah, it's the way that questions unlock kind of doorways to hidden passages that would never be before. And the discomfort in the unfamiliarity of a question or way of thinking. I love David Whyte, brilliant poet, one of my favorite poets, talk about him a lot. But the way he describes poetry is the art of overhearing yourself say something you didn't think you knew. Which I love. The poetry is really about listening.
Yeah.
And so much of what leadership, relationship, self-reflection, all really about listening keenly and asking these probing questions. How do you find yourself in moments of uncertainty like this, or if someone does pose a question to you that you've never pondered before and it asks you to kind of expand your mind or your concept of self or world a little bit, how has your journey with uncertainty and the ambiguous, I suppose, developed over time?
Well, I mean, I've kind of always been really curious and extremely kind of novelty seeking, I guess, which I think is probably part personality, but I think it's probably also part upbringing. I mean, both of my parents are very curious people, my dad in particular. And so, like, I got comfortable with not knowing things and not being able to do things sort of very early on. And so and then I've obviously trained intensely to make that even more comfortable for me. So oddly, actually, for me, it's an exciting experience. If someone gives me that, like, pops my mind open kind of a question, or I'm in an experience that I'm like, oh, I haven't seen this before, the first thing that happens is I get it, like a rush of adrenaline essentially. And I'm like, oh, yes.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Amazing. What is this? Show me more.
Yeah. Brilliant. Invigorating. What are the, for maybe those who are listening that maybe experience uncertainty or moments of ambiguity as being confronting or unpleasant or, that have our guards come up essentially. and it's all of us at some times. But
yeah, totally.
You said that there are obviously some things that you've trained in to help you along that path. Yeah, what would you offer or share with somebody who was having an experience of discomfort and uncertainty at this time?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that have really helped me a lot. One that, I was fortunate enough to get very early on from my parents, which was just to be able to kind of go, is it going to kill me?
Mm-hmm.
And almost every time the answer is no. But if the answer is yes, you still want to know that. So, and like I fortunately got that as a child because I grew up on a farm and we were allowed to do things that really most parents would not let their children do because my parents are pretty free range.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of confronted genuine risk much earlier on than probably most people have the opportunity to do. And, I'm not suggesting that parents should necessarily go quite as free range as my parents did.
Mm-hmm.
But, to put an example on it, when I was about like 8, thereabouts, we were allowed to drive the ute in the paddocks, and it was acceptable for us, so that me and my 2 siblings, one older, one younger, were allowed to say, we're going to go and do donuts in the paddock.
Mm-hmm.
And this was at a time when I was small enough that because the seats didn't move in the car, in order to get my feet to actually push the clutch down, I had to put both feet on this clutch, grab the bottom of the steering wheel and pull myself because I wasn't heavy enough to push down the clutch. And yet we're allowed to drive the car and do donuts, which is obviously nuts.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's obviously nuts, right? But because of being allowed to do things like that, you get a pretty solid feeling of what's risk that's okay and what's risk that's really actually dangerous, because we were confronting reality of real danger from a much younger age, including things like being around the animals that we had on farm. So, if you're going to help with the milking or something, we didn't have a dairy farm, but friends did. If you're going to help with the milking, that the cows aren't trying to kill you, but if you get behind them and they kick you, you can genuinely die. That's a risk where you don't play around with that one. That's not one where it's fun. That's one where it's you'll die. So don't be stupid.
Yeah.
And you see this amongst farming communities in particular, where the risks are very, very real in a way where whether something's going to hurt you or kill you, and you're probably pretty lax around the things that are going to hurt you because there's lots of those and they're mostly minor, and so you just don't stress too much.
Mm-hmm.
But you will see a very hard shift amongst people who encounter real genuine risk, where they're very playful in a lot of the spaces that feel really risky to lots of people because they know it's not going to kill them.
Mm-hmm.
And then they shift into being incredibly serious in places where that's a real one. That one can kill you. And I think that experience as a child growing up meant that my sense of genuine risk is much more fine-grained. I know where it's safe to play and it's, for me, safe to play where it's not going to kill me, basically, which is a pretty wide play space. Yeah. And so I think not that everyone can have a childhood on a farm, but everyone can kind of relate this to themselves over time, where if you continuously ask your question to yourself, is it going to kill me? And if the answer is no, it takes the fear down a notch. It doesn't necessarily solve everything, but it does take it down a notch. The next thing that I think is really helpful for people is something to help you self-soothe, which could be, it could be sort of meditation. I mean, that's a very effective way. Another one that's actually really good is just to kind of put your hand above your heart where you can feel your heartbeat and literally feel the fact that you're not dying.
Yeah.
You can use your sensory experience to kind of go, okay. And that also gives you really great feedback about how stressed you actually are, because your heart rate will be up if you're genuinely stressed. And if you kind of put your hand where you get a sensory piece of feedback about how that's going, and then you slow your breathing down, it can help you to sort of self-soothe and bring your elevation level back down to something where you can think again. Because when you when you're fully elevated, you can't actually think very effectively. And so there's not much else you can do at that point other than try and bring that level down to something you can handle.
Yeah.
So those two, I think, are very, very useful. I think the other one that I find really useful for people is if you kind of can interpret what's going on for you, like as in the threat level, if you sort of literally interpret things in terms of a fairly binary system of like either I feel threatened or I don't. And when you feel threatened, if you interpret that as actually being a signal to you that with your current understanding of the world, you don't know how to work this out. That's all it is. It literally means your brain says, hey, this could kill us because we don't know how to deal with it. And then if you ask yourself, like, is it literally going to kill me? Like, am I actually going to get hit by a truck right now? Okay, if I'm actually going to get hit by a truck, perhaps move out of the way. But the majority of the things are not genuinely actually going to kill you. So what you need to do is figure out, why does your brain think you can't handle this? What is it that you're actually afraid of? And recognize that most negative emotion is actually like built on fear.
Yeah.
It's built on the idea that you can't handle what's happening. And when you kind of get that concept and you really believe it viscerally, then even though you might be having a crap experience and even though you might be having all of the same emotional responses as anybody else, you can start to separate yourself a little and start looking at the feelings. And when you start looking at the feelings, you can figure out what they're about. What specifically can you not handle? And once you figure out what you can't handle, then you're kind of in a position to figure out how you could handle it.
Yeah.
Because before that, you're not trying to handle it. You're just trying to freak out. You're trying to run away or fight someone or something that's probably not going to help unless the thing is actually going to kill you. So I think if you can do those three things, like learn to practice getting comfortable with fear through and identifying genuine risk and being able to kind of separate yourself from like risk that'll kill me and risk that won't. And then you kind of build out some ability to self-soothe and bring your limbic system back under control. And then you build out the ability to understand and follow your emotions as data, as information about what's happening to you and why you can't handle things. Those three pieces together give you most of what you need to be able to build the rest.
And it's definitely not easy. That's the life journey of unpeeling the interpretations of our experiences. Like that's the path to enlightenment, isn't it? The self-knowledge of, wow.
The long road.
Yeah. And would you say that because when our limbic system is alive and awake and active and we are in fight, flight, or maybe freeze, the prefrontal cortex is literally switched off. So it's very hard to be rational. And so would you say then that it's useful to practice these practices when you're not stressed, when you're at ease, when you're in joy, when you're around people you love, you're not in a sympathetic response? To practice sensing your heart, your breath, to practice noticing the interpretation. Because in the moment, the heat of the moment, you're not going to remember. Would you say that?
No, not unless you've practiced.
Yeah.
And I think you want to practice both in the good situations, but also in minor bad ones. And if this is something that's like quite hard for you, where you haven't practiced it much at all, particularly in the negative situations, then I would actually argue for setting up negative situations and intentionally put yourself into them so that you can have a plan and then put yourself into the situation and then see if you can enact the plan and have some safety mechanisms around that to help you pull you out of it if you can't enact your plan once you get in there. Because, like anything, this is actually able to be practiced using deliberate practice. But most people don't think about using like genuinely good practice methods on something like this. They just roll through their life and get whacked in the face with negative experiences and then do whatever happens and then come out of it and think, God, I hope that never happens again. When actually, like, not only will it probably happen again, but something else will happen if it doesn't, like you're not, the only way to get out of negative experiences is to be dead. Which seems like a not great solution to the problem, generally speaking. So I think like it is much more functional to just kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to have negative experiences, but those will be much better if I am able to actually handle more. Mm-hmm. And there'll still be stuff you can't handle, right? Because, that's life.
Yeah.
You won't figure out that you can't handle it until it hits you and you're like, oh, thought I had that handled. Guess I don't.
Yeah.
Keep moving forward.
Yeah. And it's like sometimes I find the analogy of like bouldering or rock climbing useful. Like we have the grit of the wall and the internal tone of our capacity to meet the grit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's definitely a both and situation. It's not that we just down the grit so that we can meet it, but we build the internal tone and also maybe decrease the grit a little bit so that it's not as intense or too much of a load on our system. But eventually, to build enough tone and inner capacity to be able to meet the grit of the wall and to self-regulate, to use our practices that we've practiced to navigate the world around us. I just want to switch tone a little bit to the workplace. And some of your experiences and stories many, many questions. First of all, like your perspective on culture, what is it? How do you conceptualize culture? And then also, how do you, with clients, from that conceptualization of culture, how do you start to go about kind of engineering, facilitating, and empowering a culture that is conducive to well-being, productivity, and performance? Yeah.
So
many questions.
Yeah, great question. I think at its most simple level, culture is just what we do here. It's what can I expect to happen and what actually does happen. And, it's a very simple explanation for a very complex phenomena. But when you explain it like that, most people realize that they actually kind of can tell. There's a sort of sense that you get when you walk into a place. And that's because there's lots and lots of environmental cues that are telling you about what are the kinds of things that you can expect to happen here. And what culture is a part about our expectations, which is it's a future-paced thing. It's not what's actually happening. It's what I expect to happen. And then there's also what's actually happening. So you have these kind of two, like current and future. There's a bit also of like what has happened, but what has happened is primarily important because it informs what's possible in the future. So when I talk to people about how to actually think about what they've currently got, identify what they've currently got, and then to make adjustments if they need to, what we're essentially looking at is what is the evidence that we have available to us and how are people interpreting that evidence? And those are two separate pieces, because what we find is that the interpretation is probably something like 80% of what culture really feels like. And so the interpretation is much harder to grasp because it is not just about what's actually happening in the environment around me, but it's about what's my frame of reference for understanding that. And each person brings with them a long tail of previous experiences that they are using to interpret what's currently happening and what might happen in the future. And so like a very concrete, simple example of that happens in almost every workplace I've ever seen is that people bring with them, when they come to your workplace, they bring with them all the experiences of things that happen in their previous workplaces. So for example, if someone has ever had a bad manager, someone who made them feel afraid, they are afraid that that can happen again. Even if it's not likely to happen in the current environment, it's a possible state that they could be in now. And it's different. What happens for that person and how they interpret what's going on is likely to be different from someone who's never had that experience. Because for someone who's never had that experience, they don't believe it to be possible, generally speaking. Or the possibility space for them is theoretical. It's not real. They don't know how it felt to be in a space where somebody made them feel afraid. And like that happens in a workplace a lot because a lot of people have had some kind of negative experience at work that may be nothing to do with the current office or nothing to do with the current manager. It's just that fear is available to them because it's happened before from someone else. And so one of the things that organizations need to handle is these past experiences that people have had and what triggers that, what triggers their fear. And you won't know that unless you talk to people. And it's not necessarily the case that you can just flat out ask them because, I mean, aside from the fact that that's relatively intrusive, it's also could be the thing that threatens them, you know, so you want to be careful about how you do that. But one of the things I found really useful is asking people to tell stories, to tell me directly if they're someone who is or someone else who is safe for them. So someone who, usually it's very helpful to have someone who's a little external to the organization, who's kind of not embedded in the politics or the power structure. So having someone like me who comes in, who sort of is set up in the right way to be viewed as being both external but also strong enough to be able to influence things, that's a kind of neat setup to allow the stories to come through. And then when you can gather those stories, then you have a sense of what are the fear zones that we need to kind of be aware of, and what are the kinds of things that look like they might set people off. So one of the tricky ones is that you want to have a culture where people feel safe. And the thing that people often get wrong when they're trying to make people feel safe is that they preference kindness over clarity. And in the short term, that's relatively effective, because when you behave in a way that looks kind, you generally speaking won't hit any of the triggers of people who've had negative experiences in the past. And so they do feel safe for a time. But if the kindness continues into a space where you don't tell the truth, then the kindness starts to take on a flavor where it's a little bit undermining. It's a little bit making people feel like they're being gaslighted, and that there's an undercurrent that they can pick up, that there's something else happening that they don't know about. And when that happens, now you're in trouble, because you've got practices that mean that safety is identified with kindness, but there's a piece of information that you don't know how to deliver, that you're not telling people, and they sort of subconsciously become aware of it and start to be afraid. And then they don't trust your niceness either. And that's a tricky spot to kind of, then you need to pull out a bunch of that and actually identify it and be really explicit about it. So safety is an interesting thing, because clarity can also create safety, because it makes things predictable. Like if, for example, you know that your manager will tell you if you didn't do something well, or if the thing didn't hit the mark, then initially there'll be that like short term of like fear of having that conversation. But over the long term, what you find out is that the conversations actually are okay, and it's better to know. And you then can trust when they say that it was good, that it was actually good. So there's those kind of tricky trade-offs where people make short-term, either they make the short-term trade of like being nice at the expense of the long-term, or they're doing the other one. And what you aim for is to fold them together and have both, where you have kindness and clarity. But usually people have some bent towards one or the other to start with. And often it's actually towards the kindness end, because the people who have the bent towards clarity get labeled as assholes.
Because maybe there's a shadow that comes across as anger rather than assertion.
Exactly.
Possibly.
Or even they're just not that smooth at their delivery. So even if they're not even saying anything with any anger on their part, but it's blunt.
And the timing's off, and they haven't asked for permission, and it's... Oof,
exactly. And they just kind of didn't notice that that's a bit confronting for people. And so, you know. It's definitely in the spaces that we work, leadership development, and just in the workshop and kind of self-development space in general, the whole movement around safe space and space holding. Noticed in the last couple of years, it's really shifted more towards brave space, or more so courageous space. Because sometimes an overly safe space isn't useful at all. It can really just affirm someone in their current state. And if you're overly empathetic and just currently affirming them in their current state, yes, that's soothing. But at some point, you've got to welcome them out of it. You've got to be a light that shines, that I love you so much that I'm willing to tell you that I see this in you, and I see you here now. And how can we build the bridge between? So to have those courageous conversations, but the social technologies to have those conversations with kindness.
which is why I love Brene Brown's work. And I saw that she's obviously a big influencer in your work as well. And I think she for many of us, but the notion of choosing discomfort over resentment. Yeah. And just being willing to have those, what's the other saying? It's that many of us think that lies are sweet in the beginning. No, lies are, sweet in the beginning, bitter in the end. But truth is bitter in the beginning, but often sweet in the end.
Sweet aftertaste.
Yeah, exactly. Brilliant. So how, in organizations then, how do you start to make sense of where to begin in this relational organizational system, which is this web of everyone's past narratives and tendencies, and then also the strategy of the organization and trying to work out how can culture help the next strategy? Where do you begin in your process?
I usually begin with the leaders. And that's kind of a number of reasons why that is. One is just opportunity. It's usually leaders that sort of I get to have an interaction with. That's kind of the people who get to buy stuff in organizations. So that sort of gives you the in. But it's also that they have a really outsized effect on any culture. And so if you're trying to come in and change a culture of an organization and you don't get buy-in from the leadership, then at best, they're going to be passive. And if they're passive, then essentially you can think of them as kind of a rock that is keeping the culture where it is, because their passivity is kind of, it's stable. And so it holds things in place, which makes it hard, obviously, to change. But it's also that usually the culture is already a strong reflection of the way in which the behaviors of the leadership play out. Because humans are inherently hierarchical creatures. You know, we're still mammals. We have hierarchy in nature and in our sort of evolutionary path. And so all sort of hierarchical animals have this feature of sort of following the lead of the people above. And that is certainly true in organizations, whether people on paper have a flat structure or not. There will be people who are kind of more powerful in the organization in terms of their effect on culture. So you need to find those people and start with them. And usually that is pretty strongly correlated with being in a leadership position, but it's not always the case. Sometimes there are people who are strongly influential in the culture who are sort of not identifiable from an org chart. So you need to find those people who are culturally influential. And then you need to actually talk to them and find out, like, who are they? What effect are they having on the culture? Why are they having the effects that they are having? And how do they feel about them? Because if you're going to start intervening in the culture and trying to figure out how to change it, you need to figure out where all of the current stuff is coming from and where the willingness to adapt lies. I would always suggest that you try and sort of go with momentum where it exists already and use that to kind of forge a path and then collect other momentum behind it, rather than trying to like come in and be sort of forceful with it. It's usually just causes resistance and doesn't really work very well. So I would sort of find both the pieces that are highly influential, because you have to know where they are, but also find which ones of those, which people are the most amenable. And for the people who are the most amenable, I would start by essentially helping them to understand how culture works and some key things like, what are we doing in the short term that is hurting us in the long term? Things like, are we swapping kindness for clarity sometimes, or vice versa? Are we kind of internally doing things that mean we build up resentment? You know, so like understanding that short-term, long-term traits, helping them to understand what the behaviors are that they're currently performing that are having effects on the culture, good and bad, so that they can sort of start to become self-aware about what they're doing that is either helping or not helping. But also then I need to work with those who are not as keen, basically. And so for those people, I always try and start by understanding them, by understanding, like, why do they do what they do? What's good for them about what they're currently doing? And then finding the spaces where what's good for them is aligned with what's good for the organization, and then kind of focusing their attention on those things.
Yeah.
Because usually behaviors that are not ideal come from a good place. So they're trying to get some sort of value, and the value is real in some way, but they're not realizing that getting that value in the way that they're getting it has a trade-off that they're not intentionally having, or they're not sort of wanting.
Yeah.
So it's helping them to see how the value that they want is genuinely a value, and it is something we want to retain. And then I talk a lot about yes and. So we want to like get that and find a way to do it without it having the negative consequences, or find a way to do it and also get this other value. And like there's no one path to that, because you need to understand the individuals involved and connect with them and actually build from there towards something that will be better. And there's no one culture that works for any organization anyway. Like there's some things that are almost universally bad, but in the good space, there's lots of possibility. And so it's figuring out what do we already have that's great that we want to build on, and where are the places where we need to yes and something, where what we're currently doing is giving us a trade-off that we don't want, and we need to and something to bring up an alternative scenario that works better.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And
exactly.
And I'm curious how, because inevitably, and what I love about this work is that ultimately it's humans working out how to get along with other humans and create something bigger than ourselves, which is a beautiful thing. And at the same time, we can get lost in the work and caught up, and it becomes a bit of an emotional shitstorm. But I love it because this work, whilst it shows up in the workplace, is also deeply relevant to our lives, full stop, outside in our personal relationships with either romantic partners, family, friends. Yeah. So how do you find your work, say in workplace with leadership and cultural development, how has that influenced and had an impact also on your personal relationships? Do you find it hard to draw a distinction, to switch off when you go home? Do you find it really enjoyable to feel like you don't have to, because it's all just relationship and growth? Or how do you find the work-life balance or work-life integration conversation?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's definitely much more integration than balance. And I would say I don't switch it off really.
Yeah.
By it, I mean kind of the attempts to be better at relationships myself and to better understand what's happening around me, and to better understand the people that I am interacting with, whether that's at work or at home or whoever. So I definitely don't switch that understanding off, or at least I don't try to. I think the thing though is that this is such a strong feature of who I am, this kind of like meta thinking, deeply trying to understand what's going on for people, that it can be a lot for the people around me. I'm very fortunate to have like a partner who loves it as well, and who really appreciates that in me, which I think is probably a necessary feature in a partner for me. And I also have that in a lot of my friends. Like a lot of my friends, you know, they would be more inclined to apologize for using me as their coach than to ask me to switch it off. But that's just because I have a tendency to attract and to enjoy spending time with people who are also interested in personal growth in my private life. But I do think that there is also like part of what I do in organizations that I also do at home that sort of, I guess in a way provides a balance, is that I'm also watching very carefully for what people can handle. I don't think there's much point in breaking people.
No.
I mean, very occasionally someone is super keen to make extremely rapid progress. And in that event, with their permission, I might, if there's something that would really help that might cause them to have a sort of an unpleasant experience in the short term with a lot of long-term gain. But that's a very rare scenario. Most of the time you don't need to do that. It's a pretty crappy experience when it happens. I've had it happen to me, not necessarily with my permission, so I definitely don't want to do that to anyone else.
Yeah.
So I think like the trick is to use it in a way that is supportive rather than to use it in a way that is sort of doing things to people.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess like the agreement that I have with my partner, because, you know, he would be the person who's the most like, you know, talks to me every day. And so if it's going to get too much for anyone, it's definitely going to get too much for him. And it does sometimes. But we have an agreement between us that he's just like, okay, that's enough psych talk for now. Let's like do something else. And I'm like, okay, cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But because I have that like pretty corely ingrained in the way that I work anyway, that's generally not radically difficult to handle.
No, yeah. And it's such a beautiful gift to be that friend that people can come to.
Yeah.
For space holding or for guidance, for mirroring, whatever it is that they need. Yeah. And so to have that as a quality of a friendship is beautiful. And at the same time, to have, a level of appropriation around it, knowing that we have these tools and we do it every day. And so we could very easily slip into like a strong coaching role. Mm-hmm. But all they wanted was a bit of feedback on, you know, whether they should, I don't know, apply for this job or not. So it's really, I suppose it just calls for us to really notice as even the motive behind us holding space. Mm-hmm. Am I doing this for them or am I doing it for me?
For me.
A sense? Yeah.
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 Yeah. And it's often a really fine line.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like, I think that's one of the things that did take a little while to learn. And not to say that I have it at all perfect now, but I'm certainly much better at it than I used to be, where like turning on the coaching mode when someone isn't asking for that is a lot.
Yeah.
And it's actually surprisingly kind of like aggressive in a way. Mm-hmm. And the problem is that it's aggressive in a way where you can crack someone's mind open to something they weren't ready for without their permission. And then they can't put the genie back in the box. Mm-hmm. And that's a thing that I had to learn to kind of keep a hold on and to sort of notice and ask more actively, like, what are they actually seeking from me right now? Because you can definitely show people things that they didn't want to see. Yeah. And then that's a bit rough.
Yeah. 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 It feels like a form of manipulation. Well, it kind of is.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Especially if you later on realize that actually maybe you were doing that for yourself.
Yeah. Oof.
Yeah.
Ouch. On both sides. Yeah. So in coming to close, I'm curious, what is your vision for relationship in the world? And by relationship, I mean relationship in the workplace, but also relationship with romantic partners, friends. What is kind of a world you dream for in terms of the way we relate to?
I think the world that I dream for is where people are kind and clear and brave, and that collectively the thing that we're aiming to do is to understand reality and to actually interact directly with it and not avoid it. Mm-hmm. And that, like, it might sound kind of simple in a sense, but it's actually really hard to do because our brains are very well set up to let us avoid reality if reality is a little bit too frightening. Yeah. And so, I mean, the brave and the kind thing is essentially why I called my business Plucky Frank, because I want people to be kind of brave and to speak the truth. Yeah. But then both of those words are also kind of have a sense of warmth to them. They're not aggressive. And that's the vibe that I'm kind of seeking to put out, but also to kind of grow, to foster in organizations that I'm in and in the relationships I have with people in my private life, and sort of as an antidote to a lot of what goes wrong. Yeah. I love it. Plucky Frank. I was going to ask where that came from, but it makes total sense. Yeah. Thank you for your work. Are there any final offerings of either prose or poetry or whatever it is you'd like to offer to people in this time to be Plucky Frank? I'm not much of a poet, I have to say. Well, just any. I think the thing that I would say is to remember that most things won't kill you. And that when you recognize that, it's easier to be kind to yourself, to other people. And that, you know, if something's genuinely going to kill you, then like do get out of the way. You don't have to just sit there and take it. you can be active, and being active is genuinely going to be better in almost every situation. So yeah, like actually be plucky and frank.
Yeah.
And get out there and live rather than waiting for stuff to whack you in the face.
Yeah. Brilliant. Just similar to that poster on the back. Work hard and be nice to people. Love
exactly.
it. Yeah. So good. All right. Where can people connect with you, find more about your work?
Yeah. So LinkedIn is probably the easiest place to connect with me. It's where I'm most active. I have Twitter and stuff, but I don't really tweet much. So LinkedIn, I'm just Charlie Simson without a P, Simson. They can also find me at pluckyfrank.com, which is my website. It's currently being improved. So it's not a lot there, but there should be hopefully by the time this is published. Yeah, those would be the two main places. But please, like, if people do want to reach out, I love to connect with people on LinkedIn. I respond to everything that comes through, and I'm very happy to connect with people. I do a lot of kind of just having conversations with people because they're curious and interested in what I do, or interested to get a little piece of advice. So, and obviously all of that stuff is for free.
Yeah.
So please do reach out.
Lovely. Well, thank you for sharing the morning together.
Thank you.
Could have kept going and going. I was just noticing the time tick, but yeah. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, make sure you do connect with Charlie online, and we'll post show notes with any relevant links as well. Cool.
Thanks for having me.
No worries. What questions are still whirring inside for you? What landed and rung loudly for you? Let's take a moment. Thank you for joining me for another life-affirming and enriching conversation, each one a light, a torch to guide us on our path to being in right relationship with ourselves, those we walk with, and the ecologies we are very much a part of. I trust this has gifted you something to place in your toolkit to support you in your journey and your leadership. Make sure to connect with me and leave any comments on my Facebook or Instagram page at @ljeffrey, and check out the links in the show notes. This show is completely funded by listeners just like you, so if you feel generous and wish to be part of nourishing these inquiries that we're exploring together, you can leave a once-off donation or soon subscribe to my Patreon membership. Show notes, resources, and donations are all at www.spacesbetweenpodcast.com. Until next time, remember, we can't rush our way back. Notice connections and tend to the sweet, sweet spaces between. Lots of love.